Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Pei, or on Ayin Tes Amud Beis, the last couple of words. Dioi, what is the shir of Haitzah Shabbos when it comes to ink? Kedei lichtoiv, and the Mishnah says Kedei lichtoiv, shtei oisios, sufficient ink to write with it two letters. Tana, we learned in a Brisa, up on Pei Amud Aleph. Tana, we learned in a Brisa. This shir, this amount, this minimum amount of the dioi sufficient to write with it two letters. It doesn't matter which format you have the ink in, its location. Tana shtei oisios, this shir of two letters is whether it's bidyoi, whether it's a dry ink which needs to be dissolved to be used, or whether shtei oisios bekulmus, whether it's inside the quill, or shtei oisios bekalmerin, or the ink which has this these two letters worth is in a kalmerin, which is a inkwell. So wherever it is, in whichever shape or form, it has the same shear. You need to have enough ink to be able to use it to write two letters. Now the Rambam points out that actually you also need to take into account the ink that's going to be lost along the way. For instance, the ink inside the inkwell needs to be of a larger quantity than the ink inside the quill, because you need to account for the ink that's going to get lost along the way. When you dip the quill into the calmer, into the inkwell, some of the ink gets stuck on the walls of the quill. So you need to add a little bit to take that into account. So according to the Rambam, the shir of shtei oisios is in actuality, you need to actually practically get enough ink there to write two letters. So the shiurim here are a bit different depending on the situation. You need to always account for the ink lost along the way. You need to ensure that, practically speaking, you can get two written letters out of it. Continues the Gemara, Boi Rav asked the Shaila, what about combining ink which is located in two locations? You have one letter's worth of ink which is in a shape and a form of dioi, this hardened, dried ink. So you have a little bit of hard ink, one letter's worth, and you have ois achas bekulmus. In addition to that, you're carrying one letter's worth of ink inside the kulmus, inside the quill. Do they combine? Do you have a shear of shtei oisios? Or further, let's say you have one letter in the kulmus and ois achas bekamrin, and one letter's worth inside the inkwell. Do these two combine? What is the halacha here? Do they total a shear? Can we be mitzaref them or not? Teiku is left unresolved. Now, what would be the reason not to combine the ink that is located in, for instance, in the quill and in the inkwell? Why should we not be mitzaref them? They're the same type of item, same type of shear. Explains the Chassam Sofer that according to this Rambam that we just discussed, who tells us that there are slightly different slight variances between the amounts, the quantities that are going to be found in the kulmus, which needs a bit less, versus the amount of ink that needs to be found in the inkwell, where it needs to be a little bit more to account for the lost ink when you dip the quill into it. So according to the Rambam, the shiurim are slightly different. So perhaps, and this is Rav Shaila, perhaps we can combine the two, because we learned this earlier in the Mishnah, that when we have two materials that are not aligned in their measures, lo yishavu b'shiurein, they don't have the same shiurim, we can't combine them, we can't mitzaref them. So perhaps here as well, ink found in one location, for instance in the quill, cannot combine with the ink found in the inkwell, because two different shiurim are required. Or perhaps, at the end of the day, ultimately, this shear is really based on the same principle. You need to be able to write with it two oisios. So ultimately, it's the same shear. The way to get there, perhaps, varies by situation. So since the underlying shear is really the same, that would be a reason, yes, to allow tziruf to take place. So there's two sides of the coin here, and this indeed is the question of Rava. Can they be combined because we regard them as having the same shear? Ink always has the same shear. Or do we say, Well, the pathway is a bit different. The ink found in the inkwell needs a different shear than the ink on the quill itself. Or the ink, which is dried ink, requires a different amount than the shear on the quill itself. So we have some variances in the initial shear to account for the lost ink along the way. So perhaps it's regarded as two different shiurim, and we cannot combine these two 1 letters worth of ink. Teiku, we leave it unresolved. Continues the Gemara, Amarava. If one indeed carries out ink with which contains 2 letters worth, but he hadn't placed it in Rishus Rabbim, he hadn't put it to rest. We know that for a malacha of Eitzah, the Ma'is of Eitzah encompasses 2 parts. There's the Akira, uprooting the item from one domain, from, for instance, the Rishus HaYachid, and placing it down to rest in the Rishus Rabbim. That is the Hanocha. So we need the Akira and the Hanocha. What if he did the Akira and he carried out the ink, but he hadn't really placed it down in the Rishus Rabbim? Rather, the Kosvan Kishu Mahalach. He went ahead and he used the ink to write with it, those 2 letters, on a sheet of paper in his hands, as he's walking. So he never placed the ink on the ground, he never even stopped himself. Chayav. He is chayav. Why? Ksivasan Zuyanachasan. These letters, the ksivasam, having them written, the fact that they are written, ksivasan, they're being written, Zuyanachasan. This is regarded as their coming to rest. Explains Rashi. The ikar hanochas dioi alaksavu. The real place, the ideal place, the true place where ink is meant to end up is alaksav. It's meant to be written, recorded on a sheet of paper. Now, let's try to understand the svara. Because what is the svara of hanocha? Hanocha means the item has entered the new domain, has come to rest there, it's been incorporated in its new environment. That is the malacha of Eitzah. You take it from one environment, from one domain, you place it down, and you need to have it come to rest in the new domain. These letters, once they've been recorded, they've been written down, they've arrived at their destination. They've come to rest, even though, practically speaking, they're still moving. He's holding the paper, he's walking, but the letters themselves, the ink itself, has come to rest. Taisus has a lashon. He says he put it there. Sheishar sham la'olam. It's meant to stay there forever. That's its final destination, its final resting place. It's called hanocha. With regard to that ink, ksivasan zu anichasan. It's regarded as hanocha, as though it has come fully to rest in its place, in its appropriate location, its appropriate environment, and therefore it is considered to be a hanocha. And he is chayev on account of doing that, is regarded as an akira and an hanocha. Continues the Gemara, Vamarav. What if he carries only one letter's worth of ink? The kasva, and he wrote with it. So he writes one letter. The chazar v'hoitzi ois achas v'kasva. Then he goes back to Rishus HaYachid. He brings out another 1 letter's worth of ink. Brings it out. V'kasva, and he writes with it. So in total, he took out a full shear, but he did it step by step, incrementally. First, he took out the ois achas of ink, wrote it down, went back, took another ois achas of ink, and brought it out and used it to write. Pater, he's pater. Why? Why don't we say that these 2 halves, Amit combined to equal a full shear of Eitzah? Says the Gemara, my time, what is the reason for this exemption, for this tur? Be'idna, at the time, the Abka, when he took out the Basraisa, the 2nd letter's worth of ink, Chasale, l'shir de Kamaisa. The first shear, the first portion of ink, has already decreased its shear. Why? Rashi says, because when it dries up, it loses its volume. So right now, when he completed the Haitzah, when he took out the 2nd portion of ink, he doesn't really have a total of a shear of shtei oises of ink, because the first portion has already dried up and has lessened its quantity. and therefore he doesn't have a shear. So you must measure according to the endpoint, according to when he finishes the Haitzah, he completes taking out the 2 halves. At that point, we go back and measure. Do we have a shear? No, we don't have a shear, and therefore he's patur. V'amarav, Haitzi chatzi goigeres. If a person carries out foodstuffs, food Michael Adam, which is fit for human consumption, and the shear on that is, as we learned in the Mishnah, a goigeres, the volume which equals a dry fig. So he took out a half of that shear, a chatzi goigeres, achas, v'inicha, and he placed it down in Shusarab. V'chazar v'hoitzi, chatzi goigeres achas, v'inicha. He went and repeated the same thing again. He took out another half of goigeres and planted it in Shusarab, placed it in Shusarab. Is he chayiv? Do we say that these 2 halves are mitzdaref, they combine, and they total the full share of oichlin, which equal the volume of gergeres? Now, of course, this happened behelim echad, meaning that he had not recognized, he had not discovered his mistake until he completed both halves. So they both took place in the same period, uninterrupted period of unawareness. Says Rava, he'll be patur. Why? Rishona, the first half, the first portion, nasa kimisha kolta kelev. We regard it as though a dog snatched it midair. For instance, if a person throws something in Shusarabim and never lands, a dog comes and snatches it midair, he's patur, because the hanacha, the resting, the landing did not take place as a result of his mice, of his doing. The dog snatched it, so he's patur. Oish nisrafa. Or alternatively, if the item was incinerated mid-air, was burnt up before it landed, so those are cases where a person will be patur. Says Rava, in our case as well, when he carries half and then he carries another half, he'll be patur. We regard it, we equate it with that halacha as though the dog snatched it or it got burned mid-air and he's patur upatur. Says Rava, why? Why do you equate it to that case? Hamancha, the first half is still sitting there. Why do you say that? Well, it's as though the dog snatched it, as though we have no hanocha. What do you mean? The first half is sitting right there, and surely it's waiting to complete the shear. Meaning the Gemara understood that Rava was telling us the fact that he took it out part by part. First the first half, placed it down, then went back to get the second half. Rav is equating it to the dog snatching, meaning the hanacha becomes nullified. It's as though we ignore the first half. It's as though it never landed, it never rested, and it can't be combined and joined to the second half. So Gemara had a problem with that. Vamai, why should you apply that svara here? This case is very different. The first half is still sitting there, it's present. He placed it there, it's right there. Hamancha. He did hanacha on the first half, and he's going to join the second half to the first half. V'amai hamancha. Says the Gemara, this is what Rabbi meant to say. He wasn't speaking about this typical case of half and then half. He meant to say as follows. What happens if a person carries a half? V'im kodam v'igbiya rishayna koydem hanacha shniya. If he went ahead and picked up the first half prior to doing hanacha on the second half, so he took out one half, and prior to bringing out the second half, he lifted the first half off the ground. In that case, we don't have a shear. We don't have 2 halves sitting on the ground. Therefore, says the Gemara, Nasas Rishayna, Kimesheniklata, Shekalta Kelev, Oishanisrafo Pater. In this case, certainly, we don't have anything to combine. It's as though the first one was snatched by a dog mid-air, as though it was burnt mid-air, meaning to say that the first Haitzah, the first hanacha, became nullified. It's not here anymore. It's not in front of us. It's not present. It disappeared. It was lifted off the ground. Therefore, the second half can't join with it, can't combine with it to be mashlim the shear of Haitzah, and therefore he's pat. Upater. Ve'amarav, another halach. Haitzi chatzi gergeres. If one carries a half a gergeres, ve'inicha, and he places it on the ground. Ve'chazar v'haitzi chatzi gergeres. And he goes back and does the same thing again with another half. Ve'havira derech aleha. And he hadn't really placed it on the ground yet. He has it in his hand. So you take the second half and he passes it over the airspace of the first half. Chayav, he is chayav. Even though he never really placed it down, he's still carrying it. Says the Gemara, V'hamai, why is that so? Halay noch. The second half never landed. Kigoyin, says the Gemara, we're speaking about the case she'avira toich shleisha, that he passed the second half within 3 tfachim of the first half. So he passed it over the first half, and it was within 3 tfachim. And we know that there is a halacha of lavud. A gap which is less than 3 tfachim is considered to be non-existent. It's considered to be nullified, and therefore the second half is joining, can connect with the first half, and we have a total of a goygeris lying in Rosh Hashanah. Says, well, okay, you can combine it, but it still hadn't landed. And hanocha is a precondition for the malach of Eitzah. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, didn't Rava tell us? Toich shleish l'rabbanan, that something which is within 3 tfachim of the ground, or in this case 3 tfachim of the first half, goygeris. According to the Rabbanan, tzorech hanocha gabi mashu. There's a machlekes later on regarding between Akiva and the Rabbanan, something which is within 3 tfachim of the ground. According to Akiva, we say that it's kluta k'mishoncha, something which is within the airspace of Rosh Hashanah. It's as though it landed in Rosh Hashanah. Akiva says even higher than 3 tfachim, but the concept is that something which is in the airspace of Rosh Hashanah, it's as though it landed in Rosh Hashanah. Rabbanan disagree with that. They hold that the only time we say that something could be regarded as landed is if it practically landed on the ground, or if it's within 3 tfachim to the ground, and provided that it did land on something. Meaning, ordinarily speaking, the typical hanacha is on a makam chashav, as we learned in the beginning of Masechah Shabbos. We need a makam which is dalat tfachim, 4 tfachim long, 4 tfachim wide. We need a makam chashav, a significant area, a significant floor space, to place the item on it, to be regarded as a ma'aseh hanacha. In this case, says the Gemara, once the item has reached within 3 tfachim of, for instance, the ground, so it's regarded somewhat as already having been enveloped by the Rosh Hashanah, but it still needs to land at least on something. It needs to land even on a small, tiny area. It can't be in transit for it to be considered hanacha. Says the Gemara, so in our case, when he has the first half of Gergera sitting on the ground, and he goes and takes the second half, passes it within 3 tfachim, it's still in transit. So even though it's within 3 tfachim, according to the Rabbanan, we say that it's not hanacha. So how can you say that in this case it'll be chayiv? Again, says the Gemara inside, V'amar Rav, didn't Rava tell us? Toich shleish, even when it's within 3 tfachim, the Rabbanan, according to the Rabbanan, tzorech hanocha gabi mashu, needs to land on something. It can't be in transit. Says Malay Kash is not difficult. Kan bezorik, that halacha is referring to zorik. If one tosses an item to Shusarabim, so while it's in transit, it's not regarded as hanacha unless it actually lands on something. So even when it's within 3 tfachim of the ground, it needs to at least land on a mashu, on some small, minute area, according to the Rabbanan, to be considered hanacha. Kan b'mavir. In our case, he is holding the second half in his hand. He's being mavir. He's passing it. In this case, we don't need a hanacha on the floor because the item itself is not really in transit. He's moving the item. The item, on its own account, is really in a stationary position. It's not moving. He's moving the item. Therefore, in this case, it is sufficient to be regarded as hanacha, once again, provided that it's within 3 tfachim of the ground, or within 3 tfachim of the first half of the Gergeris. Continues the Gemara Tanur Rabbanan, we learned in the Bryce. Hoitzi chatzi Gergeris. If one takes out a half a Gergeris, v'hadza v'hoitzi chatzi Gergeris, and he goes and repeats that again, behelem echad, if he does it within 1 lapse of forgetfulness, chayav, he is chayav. We combine the 2 halves, and he's chayav chatas. B'shtei alemos, if there is some interruption between, meaning he discovered his mistake and then he went ahead and completed it with the second half, that discovery, that awareness splits the 2, and they cannot be mitzaref for a chiv chatos. Pater is pater. Rabbi Yossi Omer, even behelam echad, if it was done with 1 lapse of awareness, He's not always chayiv. It depends where he took out those two halves. L'rishus echad, if he took them both out to the same rishus harabim, chayiv, then he is chayiv. L'shtei rishus, but if he took them out to two rishus harabim, we'll see what that means soon, then he's pot. So they must come out to the same area. Amar Rabba, what does he mean? V'hu, provided sheyesh chiyuv chatis b'neim. What it means to say is as follows, that the rishus harabim was split by a rishus, by a domain, which is a biblical rishus hayachid. V'hu sheyesh chiyuv chatis b'neim. Between the two portions of rishus harabim, there is a rishus which carries a potential chatis, meaning it's a rishus harab, a rishus min haTorah. For instance, rishus hayachid. But if you have aval karmelis, but if there's a karmelis which is merely a rabbinic domain, that's not significant enough to split up the rishus harabim. So if one would take a half a gergeris to one side of the karmelis and the other one on the other side, again he's putting them both into rishus harabim. But the first one was in rishus harabim on one side of the karmelis, and the other half was placed in rishus harabim on the other side of the karmelis. The karmelis is not significant enough of a rishus to be mafsik that rishus harabim to split into two, and therefore it's chayiv. But if there's a rishus hayachid, which is splitting the rishus harabim into two, he places a half on one side, a half on the other side. The rishus hayachid splits it into two, and they're not mitzdarif to a chiv. Abaye amar filo karmelis. Even a karmelis can split up the rishus harabim. Aval pisla, but merely a block of wood that doesn't have the power to do that. Rav amar filo pisla. Even if there's a block of wood which is splitting up the width of the rishus harabim, even in that case we regard it as two separate rishus harabims, and they cannot be mitzdaref together. V'az the Rava l'tamei, Rava follows his own opinion. He's compatible with his shita, Dama Rava Rishus Shabbos, ki Rishus Gittin Damya. There's an equation between Shabbos and Gittin. Rashi explains, for instance, in the case where a person would throw a get to his wife, so Allah is he can throw it either to her directly or into her property. What if the husband loans her a property? He says, well, you can have this yard for the sake of he wants to throw the get there, so he loans her the yard. So now it's considered hers. He could toss the divorce document into that yard, and she becomes divorced. Now, what if there's a pisla there? What if there's a block of wood there in this yard, and the get actually lands on the pisla itself? So Rava tells us it doesn't work. Why? Because the pisla is considered to be its own separate area, it has its own use. It's used differently than the area around it. It's an elevated space. It's regarded as its own place. And therefore, the get doesn't work because he loaned her his yard, not the block of wood, not the space on top of the block of wood. It's considered like its own place. Says the Gemara, apparently Rava is indeed following along with this shita, because Rava over here by us tells us the same thing, that if there's the pisla which is traversing the rishus harabim, it will split the rishus harabim into two. We see that a pisla is regarded as its own separate makom shimish, its own place, its own makom, and therefore, in our case, it will split the rishus harabim. And if he carries a half a gregoris to one side of the pisla, the other half of the gregoris to the other side, they will not combine, they will not join forces to be mitzdaref, to be mechayev echiv chatas. So in summary, we learned the halacha of hamoitzi diyai. What is the sheer sufficient amount of ink to write with the two letters? The Gemara told us it's irrelevant whether the diyai is found in a solid form, dried form, or it's in the komas, the quill, or in the kalmer, in this inkwell. What about being mitzaref? Ink found in all these places, the Gemara left it unresolved with a teiku. Gemara told us a chiddush. Ksivasan zu anechasan. Merely writing these letters, even while walking, is regarded as though that ink has come to rest. The hanacha was performed. What if he writes one letter and goes back and brings out another letter's worth of ink and writes it? He's pater because the initial letter has dried up, and now he's left with less than a shear. Less than a shear of shtei oisis of diyai. The Gemara proceeded with the halacha of hitzas eichlin, which is a shear of gergeris, equaling a volume of a dried fig. So if one was mitzi a half a shear, went back inside and brought another half, The Gemara told us he's potter because we're speaking about where he lifted the first half off the ground prior to placing the second half on the ground. We have no shear to combine. What if he took out a half and then went back to take another half and carried it within 3 tfachim? In the airspace of the first half within 3 tfachim, he's chayiv. The Gemara told us that if he carried 2 halves, behelam echad, within 1 lapse of awareness, he's chayiv. Rabbi Yossi told us if he places them into 2 reshuyos, he's potter. What does it mean 2 reshuyos? Rabbi says it means that there's a shesayach, it's splitting the shesarab into 2. Abai says even a karmelis can accomplish that. Rava says even a pisla, a block of wood, can accomplish that split. Continues the Gemara. K'choil, what is the shear? What is the amount? The minimum amount of k'choil is eye paint for Yitzhak Shabbos. K'dei lik'choil ayin achas, sufficient to apply to 1 eye. Says Gemara, ayin achas? Holei kachli. Who applies only to 1 eye? Why don't you require sufficient amount to apply to both eyes, which seems to be the common practice? Amar Rav Huna shekein tznois koichlois ayin achas, because the modest women who cover their face and only leave 1 eye exposed, so they only need one portion of this koil to apply to their 1 exposed eye, and therefore that is the shear in our Mishnah. Meisivei, says the Gemara Kash, Reb Shimon Lozo Eimer, k'choil. What is the shear of k'choil? Im l'refuah, if the k'choil is meant for remedial purpose, for refuah, in that case, less is required. L'k'choil ayin achas, sufficient amount to apply to 1 eye for the refuah. Im l'kashet, if the purpose of the k'choil here is for beautification purposes, bebezinai, you need enough to apply to both eyes. So this seems to be a kasha, because we just said, Rav Huna told us that even for beauty purposes, 1 eye is sufficient. Says the Gemara, Tirguma, Hillel, Bereid, Rashwan, Achmeni. So he explained as follows: Kitanyahi, this brisa, which requires a larger amount, sufficient to apply to 2 eyes, is speaking about Kitanyahi. Kitanyahu, Bi'ar Bi'iraniyos. We're speaking of women who dwell in the villages. So Rashi explains, in those areas, in the towns, the villages, there's little schaik b'kalas reish. There's not much frivolity present, and therefore the nashim there, the women are not so particular about covering themselves to that extent as they do in the cities, because the frivolity is not so prevalent, not so common there. Therefore, they allow themselves to expose themselves a bit more, and to expose both eyes, and therefore they indeed need the k'choil to be applied to both eyes, and that is the discussion, that is the context of the brisa here, which requires a larger amount. However, the city dwellers, they only leave 1 eye exposed, and therefore, in that case, the k'choil would be a shear to be applied to 1 eye only. Continues the Gemara, Shava, what is the shear of wax? They litin al pi nekav katan, to close up a small puncture. Tana, we learned in the brisa, they litin al pi nekav katan shel yain, to close up a small puncture in a barrel of wine, which is a very small puncture. Wine doesn't need much to trickle out, so they would only make a small puncture to get the wine out, as opposed to a hole for for oil or for honey, which would be a wider hole. So here we're speaking about a very small hole, and that small amount of wax to close up that hole is sufficient for Yitzhak Shabbos. To continue the Gemara, devek glue kadei litain b'reish hashavshef, to place on top of the board. What does this mean? Tanim learned in the Brisa, kadei litain b'reish shavshef, to place on the board, she b'reish kana shel tzayadin, which is perched on top of the pole used by the tzayadin, the bird trappers. So they would place the glue on top to trap the birds. Zephes v'gofris, pitch and sulfur kadei lasois, says the Gemara, Ketana kadei lasois nekav katan, to make a small hole. A couple of explanations of this Gemara. So Rashi in the Mishnah told us that this was a container which contained liquid mercury. So first they would close up, they would plug up the opening of this kli with the zephes v'gofris, but then they would puncture a small hole in this plug in order to extract the mercury. So one shot is that The zefes v'gafres required here is the amount which can plug up this hole and still allow, it's large enough to still allow a puncture there to be made. The other pshat is that after they plugged it up with the zefes or the gafres, then they puncture the plug to extract some of the mercury. And the shear of zefes v'gafres that we're speaking here is to reseal just a little bit of zefes v'gafres, enough to reseal that small puncture which was made in the plug of the zefes v'gafres. Continues Umar charsis, crushed brick. Kedelasis pikur, to go ahead and fashion the opening of the mission says pikur shel tzorfei zav, this little furnace for the gold refiners. They would fashion a little opening where they would insert the bellow to fan the flame there. So this is the amount of crushed brick that is regarded as significant for Melachas Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says, is pitput, to make a tripod. That is the lashon in the Mishnah on Daf Yomi Shabbos. Now it appears that the shear, the amount of Rabbi Yehuda, is actually greater than the Rabbanon. He requires enough to make a tripod. Says more, is that so? Lememra, do you propose the shear of Rabbi Yehuda nafesh, that the amount of Rabbi Yehuda is actually larger, is greater than that of the Rabbanon? Ha-kaimalan. But we know for a fact, the shiur the Rabbanon nafesh. When it comes to the shiurim here of Eitzos Shabbos, the Rabbanon are the one who provide larger shiurim. They are more lenient when it comes to these things. The Snan, as we learned in the Mishnah, back on Chesam and Aleph, this was regarding the gemi, this reed grass. So what was the share according to the Rabbanon? Sufficient amount to make a tlai, a hanging loop for a sieve, a sifter, which is a large amount. Rabbi Yehuda says no, even less than that is significant, is sufficient for liability. What is the share? Rabbi Yehuda says little mimenu minas minalakatan, to use it as a measurement for the child's foot, to give it to the shoemaker to order his shoes. This is a smaller measurement than the Rabbanon. Let's see in the Gemara. The Snan is we learned in the Mishnah. To use the gemi to take with it midas minal katan, to take the size for the shoe size. So apparently Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's machmir, more stringent. He says even a smaller amount is sufficient for liability. So how come in this case of the crushed brick, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who gives us a larger share? Says the Gemara, let's reinterpret the words of Rabbi Yehuda. He didn't mean sufficient amount to actually fashion a tripod. Ema say as follows: K'dei losud pitput kirktana. K'dei losud, meaning to shore up, to fix up the tripod of a small oven, which got a little cracked up. So he's using the charsis to repair it, which indeed is a very small amount, a smaller measure than the amount provided by the Rabbanon, which was Kedlasis Pikor, to fashion the opening of the core, which was a greater amount. Continues the Gemara, Subin, Bran, Kedelitin al Pikur, Shel Tzarfizov, to use as fuel for this furnace of the gold refiners. Rashi says when they didn't have any coals, they would use bran as fuel. Tana Rabbanan will learn to the Bryce. How might he say if one carries out here? What is the minimum amount? Kedei legabel beis hatit, to mix into the cement mixture. How much cement are we speaking about? Says Tosfos, the amount of cement, the amount of clay which was produced using a revius of liquid. Continues the Bryce. A tit, what is the shear? The minimum amount of tit of clay itself. Lasois pikur, to fashion the opening of the furnace. Shel tzarfizov, of the gold refiners. Continues the Gemara. Sid k'dei lasid. Tana, we learned in the Bryce. What is the amount of lime? What is the minimum requirement? K'dei lasod etzba ktana shebebanis, a sufficient amount of lime, which is enough to smear on the small finger, on the pinky finger of a girl. Rashi says they used to actually apply it to the entire body, but the Gemara will tell us later they did it incrementally, part by part, aver by aver. Therefore, it is sufficient if he carries out a bit of lime, which is enough to smear on the etzbaktana, on a small finger, on the pinky of the girl. Rashi says they did it to enhance the glow, lihadim, to redden the skin, to enhance the appearance of the skin. The Gemara will tell us later they did it also to remove unwanted hair. Amar Vid Amarav, B'nai Yisrael, Jewish daughters, shegilu lepirkan, that have begun sprouting hair, which was a sign of maturity. Perhaps we're speaking about the pubic hair. But they have not yet come of age, and they were embarrassed about the presence of these hairs. So daughters, poor daughters, so daughters of paupers would use sid, lime, to smear on their hair to remove the hair. Wealthier ones, they would use pure psilis as the fine flour. Daughters of kings, of royalty, they would use shemen hamor for this purpose. Shenemar, as it says by Achashverosh, Shisha chadasha b'shemen hamor. For 6 months they would anoint themselves with this shemen hamor. My shemen hamor, what exactly is this? Rav Huna bar Chi Amar, sadkas, is some sort of fragrant oil. Rav Yirmiyah ba'Abba Amar, it's actually something else. It's shemen zayis, olive oil, which was extracted from unripe olives. Shemen zayis shleihevi shlish, from olives which have not yet grown to a third of their growth. Tanya Rabidoim, an piknoin, this is a term used in Gemara Menachos, which tells us that one may not use this form, this an piknoin, for Menachos. What exactly is this? This is also referring to shemen zayis, olive oil, shleihevi shlish, which was extracted from these young, unripe olives. Why would somebody anoint himself with this oil? Because it removes the hair, and enhances the glow of the skin. Rav Bivi had a daughter. Tafla, he applied the lime, aver, one limb at a time. He didn't want to overdo it. If you do it too much at a time, a person can be harmed. The overheating can have a detrimental effect. So he does it one aver at a time, and her appearance enhanced so significantly as a result of this. Shakal ba dalad me'ezuzi. There were many who wanted to marry her. Rashi says they were actually suitable candidates, and as a result, he received on her behalf 400 zuz. Now there was this person who observed this, Hava hu Nachi, there was this Gentile, B'Shavusei, lived in his neighborhood, who observed this phenomenon. He says, if this enhances the appearance so significantly, I'm going to do the same to my daughter. Havali Bati, he had a daughter. Tafel B'chad Zimna, he didn't know how to do it, so he did it all at once. So he smeared it all at once, Umesa, and she died as a result. And he complained, Amar, he said, Call tell Rav Bibi Libarti, Bibi killed my daughter. So he didn't know how to do it, so he blamed Rav Bibi. Amar Rav Nachman, Rav Bibi the Shas Shichra, Rav Bibi who was accustomed to drinking beer. Rashi says beer darkens the skin, increases the hair growth. Therefore, Bayon Bante, his daughters need this smearing. Anan, we, the Leishasin Shichra, are not accustomed to drinking beer. Loi Bayon Banton, our daughters don't need tafla, this application of lime. So, in summary, this was the shita of the Tanakama, that the minimum requirement of Hitzos Shabbos when it comes to sid to lime, is if it has sufficient volume to smear on an etzbaktan. We have two other shitas. Avida says, Kedei losod kilkul, and Rav Chemi says, Kedei losod undifi. The Gemara will explain what these terms mean. Says the Gemara, Avida oime kedei losod kilkul, to apply lime on kilkul. My kilkul. What is that? Umay andipi, which Rav Chemi is referring to. What are these two things? Amar Rav, Sida, the temple. So kilkul is referring to the temple area. They would apply the lime there as well. Ubasida, the place underneath the temple. That is referred to in the term andifi. So Rabbi Yehuda is referring to kilkul, which is the temple, a sufficient lime to place on that area. Rechemi says the amount of lime needed for the area underneath the temple, the basida, and that is the term andifi, which he uses. And the Gemara knew that the shear of Rechemi is actually a smaller amount than Rabbi Yehuda. Says, so how does that work? Lemeimra. Do you mean to say the shiur of Yehuda nafish, that the amount that Yehuda sets forth is larger in volume than Rav Nechemia? Ha'kaim Yilan, we know the shiur of Rabbana nafish, that the shiur of the Rabbana is generally greater, larger than Rav Yehuda's shiur. So how can you say that Rav Yehuda here provides a greater volume than Rav Nechemia? Says the Gemara, indeed here too, it will be aligned with that rule. Why? Because Zutim Rabbana. If you line up the shitas, let's begin from the Tanakam, the Rabbanon, which tell us Sid is Kedei Losud Etzbaktana Shebebanis. That's indeed a larger volume. So Rabbi Yehuda, who's a step under that, below that, who says K'dei Losed Kilkel, that's actually a smaller share than the Rabbanon. So in reference to the Rabbanon, he's being machmer. He provides a smaller share. Zutim the Rabbanon. He's less than the Rabbanon. However, in contrast to Rav Nechemia, who is a step under him, indeed his share is greater. But as long as his share is less than the Rabbanon, then it's compatible with the klal that the share of the Rabbanon is generally greater than Rav Yehuda. Says the Gemara, how can you say that we're referring to the Tzida and the Bas Tzida, the temple, and underneath the temple, Meisei Bevakashma Brais. Amar Rebbe. Nirin, to Rabbi Yehuda, I agree with Rabbi Yehuda's sheet that the amount is measured by K'dei Losed Kilkel. I agree with that when it comes to B'chavet, the type of lime which is the dissolved type of lime which is used to smear on that area. So indeed, this type of lime is suitable for that purpose, and therefore the shear is determined by that use. So I agree with Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to Chavet, diluted lime, dissolved lime. However, I agree with Rabbi Nechemia. The Beitzas Hasid, I maintain that the shear of Nechemia is correct when we're discussing Beitzas Hasid. Rashi says these were the lumpy lime formed into egg-shaped lumps, a thicker type of lime, and therefore that type of lime was used for the andipi, and therefore I agree with Rabbi Nechemia's shear when it comes to this type of lime, which was suitable for this type of purpose. Says the Gemara, if you're going to propose that Rabbi Yehuda was speaking about the Tzida of the temple, Rabbi Nechemia is speaking about the Bas Tzida. Tzida Bas Tzida. One never uses lumpy lime for the Bas Tzida. In those areas, all they use is the chavet, the diluted lime. So apparently Rebbe, who's referencing Rabbi Nechemia's use to the Beitzas Hasid, this is the type of lime used for his function. It can't be that he's referring to smearing the temple area, which they never use lumpy lime for. So that can't be the pshat in Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Nechemia says on Dipi, it can't be referring to the area below the temple, because they never use this type of lime. Ella Rav Yitzchak Amri Dever Rami. So in the Beis Medrash Rami they interpreted, indeed, the term andipi is not referring to smearing on the face, rather andipa. Andipa, says Rashi, is a klicheres which had a double spout. So they would plug up one of these spouts with this thick lime. Andipa, the lime placed on this in this klicheres. So indeed, lumpy lime was used for that purpose. And therefore it makes sense that Rebbe says, I agree with Rabbi Nechemia when it comes to Beitzas Hasid, which was used for the andipi to plug up this klicheres, and therefore the shear is determined according to the use of the andipi. Maskelav Kahana, how can you say lime is used to plug up the klicheres where they place wine in there? The wine will get harmed, will get damaged, will get ruined by dissolving the lime. Will a person make his money on paris? Will he forfeit his money? Will he lose his money? Is it just like that? How could you propose that lime is used for this purpose? The wine that's poured in there will dissolve the lime and will get ruined. Elam Rav Kahana, andipi apparently means something else. Shnasa is referring to these marks which were built into the measuring cups. This not as we learned in the Mishnah. This hin was a large measuring container which contained a hin of liquid. So they made marks. This is used for the Nesachim. Ad kan lepar, up until here, the halfway mark was the volume of liquid needed for the par. Ad kan le'ayil, third way up was for the ayil. Ad kan le'keves, a quarter way up was for the keves. So these were the marks they made in the measuring cup. As Rashi explains, they would color it with sid, with lime, to brighten it, so it'd be white and noticeable. And that is andipi that Rabbi Nechemia is referring to, the lime placed on these marks. And indeed, for that purpose, they would use the Beitzas Hasid, this lumpy lime. The Boisema, another pshat in andipa, is my andipa apusa. It's speaking about one's forehead. So Rashi says they would place this Beitzas Hasid, this type of lime, on the forehead to redden it, to enhance its glow. So we have four pshatim in andifi. Now, where do we find that the term andifi is referring to a forehead? As we find in the following story, there was this fellow from Galil, from Eretz Yisrael, of Bavel. He came to Bavel. The Amalei, they told him, "Kum droish lanu, come teach us b'masim merkava. Come, teach us a bit about the Masa Merkava, the heavenly systems over there, all these secrets. Amar Lahu, so he says, I can't. Amar Lahu, he said, Edrish Lahu, you think I'm going to go teach you? Just as Rav Nechemia taught these concepts, the subject to his friends. And you know what happened as a result? V'nofkas ar Isa, a hornet came out, min kaisel from the wall, umachi, and struck him bantipi, on the forehead, umis, and he died. So I don't want to get involved in this type of, in this topic. V'amrlei, and when that happened to Rav Nechemia, they said about him, min delay. It happened because of him. He's responsible for his death. He should not have discussed these hidden portions of Torah and taught it in public. So he refused to teach them this topic. But in any case, we see that the term andifi is referring to a forehead. So in summary, what is the shiur of sid? We have 3 shiurim. The amount of lime necessary to smear, either according to Rabbana on an etzba ktana shebebanos, according to Rabbi Yehuda on the kilkel, which we say is the temple, and according to Nechemia on the andipi. We have 4 pshatim, either the area below the temple, the bas sida, either to plug up the klicheres, or to color the marks on the measuring container, and finally to smear on the padachas, on the forehead. Continues the Mishnah. Adama, what is the shiur of earth? Someone explains to me a specific red type of clay. Amount necessary to create a seal on a merchandise container which was sent by ship. So they would seal it up with this type of clay. Divrei B'Kiv. You don't need that much. Is sufficient to seal a letter. Zevel, animal waste. Fine sand. What is the shiur? Kedei lezabil, to fertilize kelach shel kru of 1 plant, 1 stalk of cabbage. Divrei B'Kiv. You don't need that much. Kedei lezabil kreisha, enough to fertilize a leek. Choylakas, more coarse sand. What is the shiur? Kedei litin, to place al maloi kafsid, on a spoonful worth of lime. They used to mix the sand in there. So whatever is necessary to mix into this 1 spoon, that is the shiur for Yitzhak Shabbos. Kana, what is the shiur of a reed? Kedei lasis kumus, to fashion from it a quill. If it was thick and unsuitable to be made into a pen or marusas or crushed, then we have a different benchmark. It's going to be used as fuel, so enough of it to cook up a beitza kala, an easily cooked egg. The Gemara is going to explain that it means a chicken egg. Shebebeitzim, beitza kala shebebeitzim, the easiest egg of eggs. Trufa mixed up, stirred up with oil, and placed in a pan. The Rambam says it's speaking about a heated pan. So it's a very small amount of fuel that's needed to cook up this egg. Continues the Gemara. The shiur of choylagas was an amount which is sufficient to place al maloi kafsid. Now, what type of a kaf, what size kaf sid are we speaking about? Tana, we learned in the Brayzik de litin al pi kaf so sayodin, to place into the spoon, this trowel used by the plasterers. This was a standard size spoon. Man tana, the choyl malil sid. So the Mishnah seems to indicate that sand is actually beneficial for lime. Who is this? Who is the shita? Which view does our Mishnah represent? Mantana, who holds the choyl malil sid, that sand is actually beneficial for lime? Omer of Chizda Rav Yudi. The son, as we learned, this is referring to after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. The Chachamim instructed us to minimize simcha and to downgrade the beauty of our homes. The Brayso says, Lo yosod adam, a person should not plaster up as Beis Bisid, should not plaster up his home with lime, Elim Kain, either by teven or unless he mixed into it teven, straw, choil, or sand, which downgrades its appearance, darkens it, and only in that case it's mutter. Rabbi Doimer, teven mutter. If he mixes straw, I agree that it's mutter. But choil, if he mixes sand into the lime, that actually enhances it. Therefore, it's asur, but Pnei tracks it because it strengthens it. It makes the lime stronger, and it's actually of a higher quality. So therefore, it doesn't really help matters. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda is the one that maintains that sand increases, enhances the quality of the lime. And indeed, his view is the one that's reflected in our Mishnah. However, there are Rabbanan who allow the sid to be used even when it has the choil, apparently they don't subscribe to this. Says Gemara, no, Rava Amar, even if you're going to say that Al Mishnah represents the Shit's Rabbanan, it's still going to work out. Why? The Rabbanan agree that sand enhances the quality of the lime. However, it downgrades its appearance. It darkens it. Therefore, they allow it to be used the fact that it ruins its appearance, that is the exact same reason why they allow it to be used. So the quality gets increased, but the appearance, it loses the enhanced appearance of the lime. Therefore, they allow it to be used. Rabbi Yehuda focuses on the quality. He says adding the choil increases its quality, enhances its durability, and therefore it's us. So the Rabbanan are speaking, are looking at the appearance, and Rabbi Yehuda is looking at the quality. But both agree that the quality indeed increases, benefits through the inserting of the choil. Continues the Gemara. A reed sufficient to fashion from it a quill. Tana, we learned kumas hamagia. How large size kumas are we speaking about? Hamagia lekishra its b'isef, that reaches his knuckles. Ravashi, which knuckles are we speaking about? Kesher elyon, the knuckle between the finger and the palm. That's how long it has to be. Or kesher atachton, or the knuckle below that. Take it, we leave it unresolved. If it was unsuitable to be used for a quill, then it's going to be used as fuel. So enough needed to cook up this egg. Tana, we learned to the rice. Trufa b'shemen, mixed up with oil, unusin b'ilfis, placed in a pan, and that's the amount of kana needed to cook up this egg. It's already placed in the pan. Amalei marbre dervina livrei. Yes, the son as follows. Mishmilch. Have you heard beitza kalamai? When the Mishnah says a beitza kala, an easy egg, a light egg, which egg are we referring to? Amalei be'asa ditziltzala, an egg of a young dove. So it's very small. So he says, my time. Why do you say it's that type of egg? Mishum dezutra, because it's very small. So I'll find you a smaller egg. Hema, the tziparta. Perhaps it's speaking about a smaller egg of a hummingbird. Ishtik, so he remained silent. Amar Leis, his son asked him, Midi shmiel lechaba? Okay, so have you heard anything in this regard? Why it's called Beit Zakala? What is it referring to? Amar Leis, he told me, yes indeed. Hachem Rav Sheshes, this is what Rav Sheshes said. Beitzas tarnagoyles. So speaking about a chicken egg. Why did they call it with the term Beit Zakala? Because it cooks the easiest. Shir Chachamim, Chacham estimated, Ein lecha Beit Zakala levashel. There's no easier egg. There's no egg that cooks quicker and faster. Yoitzer me Beitzas tarnagoyles, quicker than a chicken egg. Says the Gemara. Why is it different? That Kol Shiurei Shabbos Kroyageris. Whenever we discuss a malacha pertaining to foodstuffs, we say that a malacha that was applied, that was done with a shear of a goigeris, which is a dried fig, that is regarded as significant and sufficient. And here we require a larger amount. We say a reed which can cook up an entire egg is regarded as significant. Why do we need such a large amount? Amar Leis, he said, Hachem Rav Nachman. Indeed, Rav Nachman said as follows. Over here as well, all we need is kigroigeris mi Beit Zakala. We only need a portion of this egg, a portion which equals the volume of a dried fig, to be heated up by this reed. So this portion of a chicken egg, indeed, it's compatible with all the other shiurim of Malachas Shabbos. Okay, time for a quick chazara on today's daf. We began with the halacha of one who is moitzi dioi. We require a shear, an amount sufficient to write 2 oisius. It doesn't matter whether it's dry ink, whether it's in a kumas, a quill, or in a inkwell, a kalmarin. The Gemara told us that ksivasan, their writing, is regarded as their having rested hanachasan. If he writes one letter and lets it dry up and then brings out another letter's worth of ink, it does not combine since the shear has already become decreased and diminished. What if one takes out food, a shear of gergeres, but does it incrementally? First he brings out a half. Then when he's going to bring out the second half, he lifts the first half off the ground. They don't combine any longer. What if he brings out a half, and the second half he brings over the airspace of the first half within 3 tfachim? He is chayv. The Gemara told us if he brings out 2 halves into 2 sections of shusarabim, which was split up, they were considered to be 2 rishuyos in his pot. Rabbi says they need to be split up with rishus hayachid. Abai says even a carmelist can do that split. Rabbi says even a block of wood. We proceeded with the halacha of a sid. What is the amount of lime? We have 3 shiurim according to Rabbanon, sufficient to smear on a pinky, according to Rav Yehuda. The temple, according to Rav Chemya and Dipi, we have 4 pshatim on that. We proceeded with the Mishnah, which gave us various shiurim for several items, and we concluded with the halacha ve'kanave reed. If it's suitable to be used for a quill, then the shear is a sufficient amount to fashion a kulmus, which is ad kishresh be'oisa, which reaches his knuckles. We're unsure whether we're speaking about the knuckles which connect the finger to the palm, or the knuckle below that. We leave it unresolved. If it's unsuitable to be used as a quill, then we use a shear, an amount which is suitable to be mavashal, an amount of a gergeris from a beitzas tarnagolos, which is already beat with oil, placed in a pan, trufa unesuna be'ilfas, and that is the shear of Eitzah Shabbos.